Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Mabel Leduc sat cross-legged on the cracked linoleum floor of her tiny one-room apartment, staring into the void of darkness that wrapped itself around her like a cold, silent judgment. The dim glow of her almost dead phone screen was the only source of light, casting eerie shadows across the mildew-stained walls. A thin sheet of cardboard covered the broken window, fluttering gently with each gust of wind that slipped through. Beside her one-year-old twins, Ibube and Ibuka, whimpered in their sleep, their lips dry, their bellies empty. Her breasts had long stopped producing milk, and the bottle she tried to stretch with watery pap earlier had done nothing but upset their tiny stomachs. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days herself, and the fatigue was beginning to feel like drowning, slow and silent, pulling her deeper each hour. Her soul ached more than her body, especially as she listened to their hungry sighs. Desperation was no longer a feeling. It had become her atmosphere. She opened her phone again, the battery indicator screaming red, and scrolled through her saved numbers. Bola, her friend, hadn't replied to her earlier messages. Her pastor had promised prayers, as always, but prayers didn't feed crying babies. Her former boss, who had once praised her intelligence before falsely accusing her of theft, had blocked her number. That was when she remembered the old diaper pack she had used to wrap Ibuka last week. On its back was a scrawled hotline, a number claiming to link desperate mothers with leftover donations from food vendors and kind-hearted NGOs. It was likely outdated, maybe even fake, but she didn't have anything else. Her fingers shook as she typed. Please, if you have any leftover food, I have 2 babies. We haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm sorry to beg. She hovered over the send button, her pride screaming one final protest, but she shut it out. Hunger wasn't poetic. Hunger was a knife. She hit send and watched the message go. For a long moment, she did nothing, didn't cry, didn't sigh. She simply placed the phone beside her and looked at her babies again. They had matching dimples even in their sleep, and their tiny chests rose and fell with the innocent rhythm of survival. I'll find something tomorrow, she whispered, though she didn't believe it. Her landlord had threatened to kick her out by morning. The community clinic had stopped seeing her after her 3rd unpaid visit. She wrapped the twins in the only blanket they shared and curled beside them on the torn foam mattress that smelled faintly of kerosene and dust. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Before her eyes shut, she whispered a tired thought to herself. Maybe someone will answer. But hope was a dangerous thing, and tonight it was the only thing she could afford. On the 34th floor of the Okonkwo Towers in Victoria Island, Zane Okonkwo exhaled slowly, annoyed as his phone buzzed again. The boardroom around him was silent, save for the clicking of pens and the soft thud of presentation slides changing on the mounted screen. Dressed in a tailored gray suit with his sleeves slightly rolled, Zane looked every bit the fierce and focused CEO he had built his reputation on. He ran one of Nigeria's most powerful private equity firms, a man feared not just for his wealth, but for the emotional wall he carried with surgical precision. He was known for rejecting meetings with presidents, firing entire departments with a single email, and once walking out of a Billionaire negotiation because the other party smiled too much. When he glanced at his phone and saw a message from an unknown number, his first instinct was to block it. But as he tapped the notification, the words blinked back at him. Please, if you have any leftover food, I have 2 babies. We haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm sorry to beg. He read it twice, unsure if it was some elaborate scam or spam. But there was no link, no request for account numbers or handouts. Just raw, humiliating need. And that word, twins. It was like a punch to his chest. He hadn't heard that word in a long time without spiraling. It brought back a buried ache he never allowed himself to feel anymore. His mind involuntarily flashed to Adana, the only woman he had ever loved. Her laughter in the morning, the way she used to talk to her belly like the babies could hear her. The crash had taken her life and theirs before it began. Since then, he had become an ice fortress, untouchable, unshaken, and uninterested in emotional vulnerability. His board members called him a genius. His stepmother called him a mystery. Zane knew the truth. He had stopped being human the day the doctor said, "We couldn't save her or the twins." Now, sitting in a boardroom filled with ambition and suits, one random message from a faceless stranger had cracked his silence. Without saying a word, he picked up the phone and typed a short reply. "Who is this?" No punctuation, no warmth, just curiosity layered with disbelief. The words, "I have 2 babies," kept repeating in his head. He was probably overthinking. It could be some bot. But something about the message felt real. Maybe it was the apology at the end, or the absence of demands. For someone asking for food, the message was hauntingly dignified. He closed the message app and stood up abruptly. "We'll resume this discussion after lunch," he announced. No one questioned him. They had learned long ago not to. As he walked out of the boardroom, his assistant trailed behind with a tablet full of notifications, but he waved her off. His mind wasn't on stock options or mergers anymore. It was on the nameless voice that whispered hunger and twins into his carefully controlled life. The next morning, Mabel stirred on the floor, her back aching from the hard surface. The room was humid with the sour smell of baby urine and unwashed clothing, but she barely noticed anymore. Her babies were still asleep, curled together like tiny spoons, their cheeks sunken slightly from malnutrition. She moved quietly so as not to wake them, dragging her cracked phone toward the light seeping in from the window. The battery had barely survived the night, and she tapped the screen nervously. What she saw made her blink twice. "Who is this?" The message was short, direct. Her heart jumped. Someone had read it. For a few seconds, she panicked. What if she had sent it to someone dangerous? A politician? A policeman? A predator? But then she remembered. She had already lost her dignity last night. There was nothing left to protect but the lives of the 2 children she'd brought into this cruel world. So she took a deep breath and typed a reply. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb. I thought this was a helpline. I have twins. I wasn't asking for money. Just food. I'll delete the number now. Please forgive me." She stared at the screen for a while before hitting send, tears stinging her eyes. Then she quickly followed it with another message, afraid the first might seem too abrupt. "I'm not a scammer. I was desperate. I just wanted my children to eat." She hit send again, then dropped the phone and began cleaning the room with shaky hands, sweeping dust and picking up the empty sachets that once held milk and baby food. She didn't expect another response. Why would anyone reply to someone like her? But for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. Someone had read her words. Someone had paused. At that same moment, Zane sat on the edge of his leather sofa in his expansive living room, still staring at the first message, and now the 2 that had followed. Her response was real. There was no way a fraudster would speak like that. Her tone was apologetic, cautious, yet soaked in exhaustion. "I just wanted my children to eat." He exhaled slowly, something twisting in his gut. He hadn't been able to sleep all night, haunted by Adana's voice, by the way she used to say, "Our boys will have your dimples, Zane." Now here was another woman, unknown, unseen, whispering the same kind of love. Zane stared at her final message, and then typed one more time, "Where are you?" Then he set the phone down and waited, not because he had nothing else to do, but because something inside him had already begun to change. Mabel stared at the message in disbelief. "Where are you?" Her pulse quickened, and her fingers trembled as she held the phone. The voice on the other end, whoever it was, had not just replied, but wanted to know her location. Panic fluttered in her chest. She didn't know if she should be relieved or terrified. What if it was someone dangerous pretending to care? Lagos was a city of masks. Kind voices often hid cruel intentions. But behind that fear was something deeper. Shame. How could she possibly invite someone into this place? A one-room apartment with a cracked ceiling, a rusted fan hanging limply from the wall, and empty shelves that hadn't seen food in days. No curtains, no baby cot, no pride. She couldn't let a stranger, even a helpful one, see her like this. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then deleted the reply she had started. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and whispered, "God, I can't even afford to accept help without feeling dirty." After a few minutes, she typed cautiously, "Thank you, but I can't give my address. I don't want to be a burden or expose my babies to anyone. I'll be fine. I'm sorry for bothering you." She stared at it for a long time, then added one more line, "Please don't worry. We'll be okay." It was a lie, of course, a soft, trembling lie that she wrapped herself in like a second skin. She had nothing. No job. No savings. No family. But she had made it this far. Somehow. She sent the message, tucked the phone away, and got up to boil water, not for tea, but to mix with a pinch of powdered pap to soothe the babies. As she moved about, she kept glancing at the phone like it was a living thing, like it might cry out if she ignored it too long. But no reply came. Silence returned to the room like an old, unwelcome friend. Meanwhile, Zane read her response and sat back in his chair, processing the refusal. There was something about her insistence on protecting her children that gripped him. It wasn't pride, it was dignity. He'd encountered thousands of people begging for contracts, donations, or favors, and most of them came with a whiff of entitlement. But this woman? She didn't even want to be found. That made her real. And that made her unforgettable. He called his tech lead at midnight. "I need a geolocation scan on this number. I want to know where the last message was sent from." The staff hesitated. "Sir, that's private." Zane's voice hardened. "Do it." Within an hour, he had an approximate address. He stared at the location for a long time. Mushin, a densely packed area filled with life, chaos, and stories like hers. Except hers had reached him. For reasons he couldn't explain, he ordered one of his security aides to send a discreet grocery package. No branding, no identification. Just food, diapers, and infant medication. And at the very bottom of the box, tucked beneath the bread loaves and tins of milk, a small handwritten note. "You don't owe me your face. But your babies deserve food." The knock at Mabel's door the next morning startled her so sharply she spilled half the pap she was trying to feed Abub. Her heart leapt to her throat as she looked toward the door. No one ever came by this early, not even Bola. Her first instinct was to hide, then to protect. She wiped the baby's mouth and picked both twins into her arms quickly, whispering she was okay, even though she didn't believe it herself. The knock came again, gentle but steady. She crept to the window and peeked through a slit in the cardboard that covered the broken pane. A man stood outside, wearing delivery overalls. Nothing about him looked threatening, but still, she hesitated. "Madam, now you be Mabel?" the man asked. Her breath caught. She hadn't given her name to the man who messaged her. Her mind raced. She pushed the door open halfway, shielding her babies behind her. "Who sent you?" she asked. The man gave her a polite smile. "I no. I just get address and package, say make I deliver. No get sender name." The box he placed by the door was heavier than it looked. When she finally brought it inside and tore the lid open, she gasped. Inside were neatly arranged bags of rice, packs of noodles, a large tin of powdered milk, diapers, medications, tins of baby food, and bottled water. She reached in with shaking hands, her mouth dry, her soul trembling. It wasn't just the quantity. It was the dignity. Everything was packed cleanly, thoughtfully, and without flashy branding. There was no pity note, no religious leaflet, no camera crew looking for a photo op. And then she saw it, the note. Just one simple sentence, handwritten in black ink. "You don't owe me your face. But your babies deserve food." Mabel collapsed to her knees, tears pouring down her cheeks, as her babies reached curiously for the box. It was the first time she had cried in months, not out of pain, but from a kind of relief she hadn't felt in years. Someone had seen her. Not her body, not her story, but her soul. Zane, sitting at the edge of his desk, stared at the wall-to-wall windows of his penthouse, but saw none of the Lego skyline. Instead, he saw the image of a woman he hadn't met, holding twins, refusing pity. For a man who had spent years avoiding emotion, he suddenly found himself unable to focus on any of his pending calls. He had sent her what she needed, but it wasn't enough. Not because he wanted more from her, but because he couldn't get her off his mind. Was it guilt? Was it the ghost of Adana guiding him? Or had the universe finally shoved someone through the walls he built too high for love? Either way, he called his driver and gave him a simple command. I want to see that neighborhood. Drive me there. No security, no convoy. Just us. The driver hesitated. Zayn had never made such a request. But he obeyed. As they drove through the bustling streets toward Mushin, Zayn looked out the window, scanning every face, wondering which one had whispered hunger into his world and walked away. The following day began like any other, humid, hazy, and heavy with survival. Mabel had just finished sweeping the front of her compound when she heard the sharp honk of a car. Not the rickety Kiki or dented Danfo that usually passed by. This was different. She looked up and saw a sleek black car pull up just beyond the entrance. A man stepped out, tall, dark-skinned, well-dressed in jeans and a plain white shirt, but he moved with a confidence that didn't belong here. For a moment, Mabel's heart clutched. Then she noticed he was carrying a black plastic bag, not fancy shopping bags, not anything showy. He scanned the compound, then walked toward her slowly. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm, low, and unfamiliar. "Is Mabel around?" She stiffened. She was Mabel, but she didn't say that. Not yet. Not until she knew who he was. "Why?" she asked cautiously. "I have something for her," he replied, handing over the bag. Inside were more baby supplies. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and accepted it, her eyes not leaving his face. There was something haunting in his eyes, a kind of sadness wrapped in stillness. "Did you send the box?" she asked finally. He nodded. "I don't want to intrude," he added quickly. "I just wanted to see for myself that you and your babies are okay." Mabel hesitated, then opened the door slightly. The twins were on the floor, behind her, crawling toward the bag with curious eyes. Zayn's gaze followed hers, and the moment he saw the boys, his knees nearly gave way. They looked exactly like the dreams he used to have, the ones of Adana smiling with two little boys bouncing on her hips. For a split second, he imagined reaching for them, but he stopped himself. This wasn't about him. This was her life, her space. "I didn't expect any of this," Mabel said, her voice soft now. "Most people just ignore me. Or insult me." Zayn smiled faintly. "I'm not most people." Then he reached into his pocket and handed her a card. "If you ever want to work again or talk, or even just rest for a day, that's my number. Call it." Mabel stared at the card, stunned. "I don't know who you are," she whispered. "But thank you. Truly." Zayn turned to leave, but before he walked away, he said something that made her heart pause. "You don't have to stay invisible. Not to everyone." Then he walked back to his car. Mabel stood by the door, babies clinging to her legs, the card still in her hand, the bag of gifts by her side, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. Zayn sat alone in the dim library of his penthouse that evening, the lights turned low, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. His fingers hovered over an old photo album tucked in a locked drawer that rarely saw daylight. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the accident that stole Adana and the unborn twins he had barely begun to imagine. Tonight, he opened it slowly, as though the photos might hurt him again. There she was, Adana, laughing by the beach, her hands covering the gentle swell of her belly, eyes filled with life and mischief. Zayn traced the photo with one finger, his throat tightening. She had been the only woman who saw beyond the empire he was building. She didn't care about the Okonkwo name, the private jets, or the black card credit accounts. She had loved him in his most raw and unguarded form. And it was that love, that dangerous vulnerability, that had been snatched from him too soon. The night she died, he had been on a video call, distracted by a merger with a South African firm. She had told him she was heading to the pharmacy, craving Accra again. He had laughed. That laughter was the last thing she heard. The guilt had wrapped itself around Zayn like a python, squeezing slowly over the years until he had no room left for emotion. After Adana's burial, he had shut down emotionally, refusing even therapy. Friends stopped calling. Family learned to give him space. His stepmother Ngozi was the only one who remained close, But even she knew not to mention Adana unless she wanted to be met with silence. He poured all his grief into his business, building walls higher than love could climb, choosing cold reason over vulnerability. Occasionally, he would dream of the twins, never seeing their faces clearly, only the shape of their laughter and the echo of a woman who once believed he could be more than a CEO. That's why the message from Mabel had struck him like thunder. The word twins didn't just ring a bell, it was a scream from a ghost he thought he had buried. But what was even more haunting was how she hadn't asked for money or pity, just food, just dignity. And that stirred something in him Adana once described as the part of you that's still human, no matter how rich you become. He leaned back, gripping the sides of the chair as if to anchor himself to the present. But the memories poured in, flooding the walls he'd rebuilt so carefully. Adana singing to her belly, her voice over the phone, the broken glass of the crash site, the twins that never cried, the nurse whispering, "We're sorry, sir," like an afterthought. He clenched his jaw, his heart aching with an emotion he couldn't name. Mabel and her boys weren't ghosts. They were flesh and breath and struggle. And now they were in his orbit. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to let them stay. Still, something inside him, something ancient and aching, whispered that perhaps this time, fate was giving him a second chance. Not to rewrite the past, but to do right by the living. The next time Mabel saw Zane, it was at her doorstep again, this time in broad daylight. She had just returned from washing her baby's clothes by the roadside tap when she spotted the sleek black car parked outside, attracting stares from curious neighbors. Her heart thudded, unsure if it was awe, fear, or something she didn't want to name. He stepped out casually, dressed in a plain gray kaftan and slippers, blending into the Lagos heat like a man far removed from boardrooms and headlines. "You again," she said, half smiling as she wiped her wet hands on her wrapper. He didn't smile back, but there was warmth in his eyes. "I didn't come to impose," he began, voice quiet. "I came to offer you something." Mabel raised her brow. "What could someone like you possibly offer someone like me?" she asked, almost laughing. Zane hesitated, then extended a document. It was an employment offer, a role at one of his literacy foundations as an administrative assistant. Salary included, daycare provided. Mabel stared at it for a long time, unsure how to feel. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, unable to hide the suspicion in her voice. "Is it guilt? Pity?" Zane didn't flinch. "No. If it were pity, I would have handed you a check and left. But I've seen what you do with nothing, Mabel. Imagine what you do with a little support." She looked away, emotions battling in her chest. The shame of needing help, the pride of having survived this long alone, and the undeniable yearning to finally be able to provide for her children on her own terms. She hadn't worked since her name was dragged through the mud years ago, after being falsely accused of leaking confidential files at her old job, a setup orchestrated by her jealous boss who saw her potential as a threat. That scandal had cost her everything: her job, her reputation, her housing, even friendships. No one wanted to be associated with the thief with twins. And yet, here was this stranger, a man with power, offering her a path back. "I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted. "I don't even know who you are, not really." Zane nodded. "I'm Zane Okonkwo," he said simply, "CEO of Okonkwo Holdings. But forget the titles. All you need to know is I'm not here to rescue you. I'm here to walk beside you if you'll let me." The words struck something deep within her. She remembered nights when she'd whispered into the darkness, asking for just one person to believe in her again. Maybe this was her answer. Maybe not. But something told her she had to try. She reached for the paper, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Okay," she said softly, "but I won't take charity. If I do this, I earn it." Zane nodded, a small smile tugging at the edge of his lips. "That's all I ask." And just like that, an invisible thread was woven, not of romance, not yet, but of mutual respect, the kind that could survive storms. Mabel stepped into the brightly lit hallway of the Okonkwo Literacy Foundation a week later, her heart pounding, as if she were stepping into a courtroom. The front desk buzzed with quiet activity, and children's artwork adorned the walls in vibrant bursts of color. She wore a simple blue blouse and a long black skirt that Bola had helped her wash and iron the night before. Her hair, braided into a neat bun, was tucked under a headscarf, and she clutched a worn handbag that held the only copy of her credentials, a degree she had earned with distinction before life swallowed her dreams. The receptionist greeted her with surprising warmth. "You must be Mabel. Mr. Zane said you'd be starting today." The words shocked her. Mr. Zane. It was still surreal that someone like him, someone with skyscrapers under his name, had invited her into his world. But even more surprising was the fact that he hadn't called or followed up since their conversation. He had simply opened the door and waited for her to choose if she'd walk through it. She was assigned a desk near the administrative office and quickly met her supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Auntie Laura, whose no-nonsense tone was offset by twinkling eyes. "We don't do eye service here," Laura said, handing Mabel a folder. "Zane doesn't like noise. He likes impact. I don't know what your story is, and I don't need to. Just do your job, and you'll be fine." Mabel nodded, a lump rising in her throat. She had prayed for a second chance. Now it was here, and she wouldn't fumble it. Her day passed in a blur of files, spreadsheets, and orientation sessions. At lunch, she sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, watching the other staff laugh and chat. She didn't blame them for not inviting her in. Her clothes weren't as polished, her shoes slightly worn, and her name still felt unfamiliar in the room. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was no longer invisible. She was working. She was rebuilding. One task at a time. Zane watched her from his office through the frosted glass. Not because he was monitoring her performance, but because he couldn't help himself. There was something about Mabel's posture, her quiet efficiency, her refusal to seek attention. He had seen so many people perform for power. She, on the other hand, performed for survival. And it stirred something unfamiliar in him. For the first time in years, he stayed later than usual, not to sign deals, but just to walk the halls. When he passed her desk and caught her organizing donation requests without being told, he stopped. "You're settling in well," he said casually. Mabel looked up, a tired smile on her face. "Trying not to drown," she replied. He chuckled. Not a full laugh, but something close. "You're not drowning, Mabel. You're learning to swim again." And as he walked away, something in her chest fluttered. Not love, not yet, but hope. And for someone who had once texted a stranger begging for food, hope was the most luxurious thing she had ever felt. Cassandra Ease adjusted her sunglasses as she leaned against a Range Rover in the parking lot of the Lecky high-rise where her friend Ada was hosting a private brunch. Though she hadn't seen Zane in months, her thoughts had never strayed too far from him. Not since she lost access to his network, his penthouse dinners, and the quiet prestige of being linked to the most elusive billionaire in Lagos. Their breakup had never been formal. It was more like she woke up one morning and realized Zane had stopped returning her calls, stopped indulging her expensive tantrums, and simply moved on in silence. At first, she had assumed it was just another phase. But that was before Ada, mid-sip of champagne, casually pulled out a tablet and said, "You haven't seen this?" She had scrolled through the blog post titled, "Okonkwo Foundation hosts literacy event for underprivileged women and children," featuring a photo of Zane in a white shirt standing beside a dark-skinned woman with a baby on her hip and another tugging at her wrapper. The woman was smiling. Zane, though not touching her, was looking directly at her with a softness Cassandra hadn't seen since Adana. For the rest of the brunch, Cassandra couldn't hear a word anyone said. The image burrowed itself into her mind like a thorn. Who was she? What kind of woman had that kind of access? And how could Zane, her Zane, be seen in public with someone who looked like she came straight out of Ajagunal? Cassandra tapped her perfectly manicured nails on the table, her jaw clenched as she zoomed in on the photo. The woman wasn't modelesque, but there was a quiet beauty about her, the kind of beauty that didn't need foundation or filters. And that made it worse. It wasn't about status. It was about connection. Zane never looked at Cassandra that way, not even on their best nights. She spent the next few hours deep diving into anything tagged with hashtag Okonkwo Literacy Foundation. More photos surfaced. Mabel was always in the background, but never unnoticed. And the twins, oh the twins. Cassandra's rage boiled the moment she saw a caption that said, Okonkwo spends quality time with twins at outreach event. Twins? Zane hated being around children since Adana died. What had changed? The answer was obvious. Her. Mabel. A nobody with nothing. Cassandra knew exactly how these things worked, the Cinderella effect. The billionaire finds a charity case, plays savior, and thinks he's discovered virtue. But it never lasts. Men like Zane always return to their class, their kind. Cassandra stood, her plan already forming. She would bump into him, gently of course, remind him what it felt like to be seen with a woman who fit into his world. She'd plant herself back into his space and erase whatever fantasy this girl was selling him. After all, power wasn't just about beauty. It was about knowing how to strike when no one saw it coming. And Cassandra had perfected the art of striking quietly. Her lips curved into a smile. Mabel had no idea what storm was coming. Mabel was wiping down the shelves in the administrative wing of the foundation when she heard two junior staff whispering in hushed tones near the water dispenser. Their conversation wasn't meant for her ears, but the words sliced cleanly through the air. You know they say she's Zane's new pet project? One girl chuckled. A project with twins, ABI? I heard her former boss fired her for leaking files. These charity girls know how to play the sympathy card. Mabel froze mid-motion, the cloth dangling from her hand. For a moment, she felt like she was falling, not physically, but internally, like her soul had been kicked down a flight of stairs. She didn't turn around. She didn't confront them. She simply finished wiping the shelf, her grip tightening around the rag until her knuckles whitened. She had expected whispers. She had even prepared herself for judgment. But she hadn't anticipated how fast the past would crawl out of its grave and wrap itself around her name again. By lunchtime, the murmurs had multiplied. She noticed how some of the staff, who once greeted her with casual warmth, now passed her with forced smiles or avoided her gaze altogether. Even the cafeteria, once a space she could quietly eat in peace, became a minefield of stares. "Nah, so all of them day start," one woman muttered under her breath as Mabel passed. From slum to skyscraper, all because she born twins way resemble Olga. The sting of those words lingered even after she left the room. She wanted to scream that the twins weren't his, that she had never touched Zane, let alone seduced him. But the truth was no longer relevant. The story had taken on its own life. Someone was feeding it. And Mabel had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who. Cassandra. She had spotted her once from the foundation gate, seated in a tinted SUV, sunglasses perched like a queen surveying her court. Their eyes had met. Mabel hadn't flinched, but Cassandra had smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I see you, and I'm about to erase you." That evening, when Zane passed her office, she didn't look up. He paused by the door, waiting for the usual nod, the quiet warmth. But it didn't come. Instead, Mabel stood, gathered her things, and walked right past him. He caught her wrist, gently. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etched into his brow. She didn't answer immediately. Then, without turning to face him, she said, "Your world has sharp teeth, Mr. Okonkwo. I don't want my children chewed up in it." He tried to speak, but she pulled her wrist free and kept walking. Behind her, Zane felt something break, something he hadn't realized he'd been nurturing. He had brought her into his orbit to save her. But maybe he had also brought her into a battlefield she never deserved to fight. And the worst part was she was fighting it alone. Zane sat alone in his office that night, long after the staff had left, staring at the grainy images on his laptop screen. He had asked his private investigator to quietly look into Mabel's past after the gossip grew too loud to ignore. Not because he believed the rumors, but because he wanted truth to stand taller than speculation. The report in front of him was short but disturbing. It confirmed what Mabel had once hinted at. She had been framed by her former boss, Mr. Akinlade, for leaking company documents. A deeper investigation revealed that she was actually the whistleblower who had discovered internal fraud, but instead of being commended, she had been threatened into silence. When she refused to falsify data, the manager had launched a smear campaign, accusing her of data theft. The company fired her within a week. No hearing, no HR protection, just silence. The narrative spread quickly. In the corporate world, perception was reality. And for a young woman without powerful connections, that reality had destroyed everything she had worked for. Zane clenched his jaw, fury bubbling just beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what enraged him more, the injustice, or the quiet dignity Mabel had carried despite it. She hadn't tried to explain herself. She hadn't played the victim. She had simply survived. He closed the file and stood pacing his office. He thought of the look in her eyes earlier that day, not fear, but weariness. Like someone who had been through one storm too many. He picked up his phone and dialed his legal team. I want a full legal analysis on Accolade and Company. I want the original case reopened. Find out who buried the evidence. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, that's outside our jurisdiction. Mabel hasn't filed. Then do it in my name, Zane interrupted. We'll start with a defamation suit. I don't care if it takes a week or a year. We fix this. The next morning, as Mabel walked into the foundation, she was met with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Silence. Not cold silence, but respectful quiet. The whispers had stopped. Some staff even nodded politely. Confused, she walked into her office and found a document on her desk with a note scribbled in Zane's handwriting. I never believed them. But the truth needed to speak louder. Z. Attached was a printed copy of a public apology from Accolade and Company, posted across major platforms that very morning. It admitted to a misunderstanding in records handling and cleared Mabel of any wrongdoing. Below it, legal notice of pending defamation charges. Mabel sank into her chair, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't dared hope for justice. But here it was. Not from the world. Not even from the system. But from a man who had once been just a stranger on the other end of a desperate message. And in that moment, her heart whispered something terrifying. She was starting to believe again. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and ambition. The Okonkwo Foundation's annual Hearts and Hands fundraiser had drawn Lagos' finest. Politicians, business moguls, fashion elites, and socialites. It was the kind of event where charity and clout danced in the same rhythm. Zane, dressed in a tailored navy tuxedo, stood near the grand staircase, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the room. Beside him stood Mabel, in a modest yet elegant emerald green gown loaned by the foundation stylist. Her first real evening were since university. Her hair, braided into a soft updo, glistened under the soft lights, but her eyes darted around nervously. Are you sure I should be here? She had whispered earlier. You belong here, Zane had replied simply, and though she had nodded, she didn't believe it. Not yet. Across the room, Cassandra stood by the champagne bar in a golden dress that fit like silk over fire. She watched Mabel like a lioness studying her prey, calm, precise, cold. She had spent the last week planting stories in tabloid circles and whispering poison into the ears of powerful guests. She even tipped off a particular blogger about Mabel's scandalous history, ensuring the old narrative was ready to resurface if tonight didn't go her way. As Mabel excused herself to check on the twins in the children's lounge upstairs, Cassandra seized her moment. She moved swiftly across the floor and cornered Mabel near the stairs, voice low and sharp. I see you've learned how to dress up poverty, she sneered. Mabel blinked, startled. Do I know you? Cassandra laughed. Oh, sweetheart, you know exactly who I am. I'm the past, the future, and the mirror Zane's about to break. Mabel, shocked but calm, tried to walk away, but Cassandra stepped in closer, her voice venomous. You think he'll marry you? Please. Zane mourned Adana for years. I was there. I picked up the pieces. You're just a memory bandage. And when he's done playing savior, he'll rip you off like the stain you are. Mabel's breath caught, but she refused to show weakness. If he was with you, she said evenly. Why isn't he now? Cassandra's eyes narrowed. Because I let him go. You think you've won something? Wait until the city turns on you. Wait until the headlines scream. Slum girl with scandal past sleeping with billionaire boss. Because, believe me, I already wrote the draft. Mabel stood frozen as Cassandra handed her a printed gossip blog preview, complete with an old, edited photo of her at a bus stop, altered to appear like she was being dragged out of a club. Mabel's heart pounded. Cassandra gave her one last smirk before walking back into the crowd, her heels clicking like gunshots. And just like that, the night that was supposed to elevate Mabel shattered before her eyes. The next morning, Lagos woke up to headlines that attempted to light the internet on fire. One blog led with, "Who is Mabel Aduak? The mystery woman behind Zayn Okonkwo's recent softness." Another boldly questioned, "From slum to silk, billionaire's new flame or calculated opportunist?" The articles were laced with innuendos, half-truths, and carefully curated images. Zayn sat in his home office, a storm swirling inside him as he scrolled through the mess. Mabel had not returned his calls since the event, and he had a gut-wrenching suspicion that Cassandra was behind it all. He didn't need proof. He knew Cassandra's brand of sabotage. Her elegance always concealed her venom. His PR team had already started writing a neutral statement, but Zayn interrupted them. "No, we don't defend lies. We destroy them." He called his lawyers, his cyber investigators, and his media strategist. "I want a press release. I want documentation. And I want the truth everywhere by noon." At 11:47 a.m., social media flipped on its head. Zayn's official handles released a video, a calm, well-spoken Mabel seated beside a legal analyst. The lawyer walked the public through the defamation suit already filed months ago, with timestamps proving Mabel's innocence and the injustice of her past dismissal. Following that was a formal statement by Zayn. "I do not associate with rumors. I stand by facts. Mabel Aduak is not my charity case. She is the woman who reminded me that integrity doesn't live in wealth. It lives in those who've been through hell and still walk with their heads high." Screenshots of Cassandra's previous communications with tabloids, leaked by an anonymous source, flooded WhatsApp groups. Her plan had backfired. She had awakened a giant, not just in Zayn, but in public empathy. Women groups began reposting the video. Feminist blogs praised Mabel's quiet dignity. They tried to bury her, one post read, but they didn't know she was a seed. Mabel watched it all unfold from the modest living room of Bola's apartment, where she had gone to breathe and cry in silence. When she saw the video of Zayn defending her publicly, her heart clenched in disbelief. He didn't owe her this. He could have walked away, and no one would have blamed him. But he hadn't. Bola, sitting beside her, grabbed her hand. "Girl, do you know what just happened? He fought for you. Like publicly. Like a man who isn't ashamed." Mabel felt the tears well up again, but they were different this time. Not tears of shame or fear, but of something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Being protected. The truth had been buried for so long that she had stopped trying to unearth it. But someone had dug it out, wiped the dirt off, and placed it where the world could see. And in that moment, as she held her twins close and whispered, "They won't take us down," she realized something powerful. Her name had finally been returned to her. Zayn didn't knock when he showed up at Bola's apartment that evening. He didn't have to. Bola had texted Mabel that he was on his way, and the quiet thrill in her stomach had begun bubbling the moment she read it. She opened the door to find him standing there, in a plain black shirt and jeans, no security, no armor, just a man who looked tired and soft. For a few seconds, they just stared at each other. Then he stepped in, and the door clicked shut behind him. "You didn't have to do all that," Mabel said, breaking the silence. Zayn looked at her, not with anger, not with pity, but with something gentler. "I didn't do it for you," he replied. "I did it for the truth. And maybe a little for the part of me I forgot existed." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You remember that part because of me?" He nodded. "You reminded me that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in small rooms, in the cry of twins, in the dignity of someone who has every reason to give up, but doesn't." They sat on the sofa, side by side, neither rushing to speak. The twins crawled toward him, giggling as they always did when he was near. Zane lifted Ibuka onto his lap, the boy grabbing his shirt collar like he belonged there. "You know," Zane said quietly, after Adana, "I told myself I didn't deserve a family. I stopped dreaming about it. I buried every part of myself that wanted this: laughter, warmth, chaos." Mabel listened, her heart aching for him in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm not Adana," she said gently. Zane looked at her. "I know. And that's why this is real." She reached out and held his hand, and they sat like that, a woman who had suffered in silence, and a man who had armored his heart, finally letting the weight of their pasts breathe between them. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions. Just two people, quietly choosing to see each other. Later that night, after the twins were asleep and Bola had gone for a walk to give them space, Zane turned to Mabel. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "but I want to find out. With you. No noise. No pressure. Just us." Mabel took a long breath and nodded. "But you should know something," she whispered. "I'm still healing too. I still have nights I panic over things I can't control. I still feel like the world is waiting for me to fail again." Zane leaned closer, brushing a stray braid from her forehead. "Then let's heal together," he said. "Let's build something that doesn't pretend we're perfect, but proves we're stronger than what tried to break us." And in that quiet, unassuming moment, something changed, not the world, not the headlines, but their hearts. And for the first time since that desperate text message was sent, Mabel no longer felt alone. Zane stood before the jewelry box on his nightstand, staring at the modest silver ring nestled inside. It wasn't flashy or crowned with diamonds. He had chosen simplicity on purpose. A clean white gold band with a small emerald in the center. A mirror of the dress Mabel wore the night of a fundraiser, the night he realized how much she'd unknowingly become part of his healing. For years, his life had been dictated by precision and control. Business deals, quarterly projections, immaculate press statements. But this was the first decision he made with emotion, and it terrified him. He had spent the past few weeks watching Mabel blossom, not just at work, but in spirit. Her confidence was no longer hesitant. Her eyes no longer constantly scanned for danger. He had fallen for the quiet grace of her strength, the way she loved her children fiercely, but gave her heart cautiously. And now, as he slipped the ring into his jacket pocket and headed out, he wondered if timing was something the heart could ever truly prepare for. He invited her to a quiet rooftop cafe that evening, a place with warm lights, hanging ivy, and a gentle breeze. Mabel wore a cream-color gown, her hair in a soft twist, her makeup minimal but radiant. Zane couldn't take his eyes off her, not because she looked beautiful, which she did, but because she looked free. "You've changed," he said as they sipped tea under the stars. She smiled gently. "I'm still me, just remembering who I was before the world tried to erase me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring box, her breath catching the moment she realized what was happening. But before he could open it, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Zane," she whispered, her voice tender, "don't." He paused, stunned. "You don't want it?" She shook her head, eyes soft but steady. "It's not that. It's just, I want to be chosen for who I am, not what I remind you of. Not as a redemption for what you lost. And not because I've helped you remember love." Zane looked away, the ring box still closed between them. He felt the sting of rejection, but he also saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't rejecting him. She was protecting the foundation they'd barely begun to build. "I don't want to be rescued," she continued. "I want to be walked with, not carried. I've come too far to go back to being someone's shadow." Zane nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Then I'll walk with you. Ring or no ring." She reached for his hand again, this time holding it tightly. "Maybe one day," she said softly, "when we both know this is about forever, not healing." And under the sky that had once watched her cry herself to sleep, Mabel said no to a proposal, not because she didn't love him, but because for the first time in her life, she was choosing herself. Ngozi Okonkwo stared at her reflection in the floor-length mirror of her private suite, adjusting the diamond studs in her ears with clinical grace. She had been Zane's stepmother for over 20 years, but it was the last 10 that had solidified her influence. After Adana's death, she had filled the role of emotional buffer, the woman who filtered visitors, silenced gossip, and helped Zane keep the world at a distance. But now something was shifting. Zane was smiling more, staying late at the foundation, attending baby product expos of all things. And the reason had a name: Mabel. A woman Ngozi had never met, but already disliked. It wasn't personal. It was generational. The Okonkwo legacy was built on image, class, exclusivity. Bringing in a woman from the slums, with twins and a scandal-ridden past, it was a threat. And Ngozi, who had protected the family's prestige like a relic, wasn't about to let it crack under the weight of sentimentality. She waited until Zane visited one weekend, casually suggesting tea in the garden. When he arrived, she poured it herself, always smiling, always composed. "So this, Mabel," she began, sipping from a porcelain cup. "I hear she's been spending time with the twins in your home office. That's very domestic." Zane raised a brow, but said nothing. She leaned in slightly. "Don't get me wrong, I admire your heart, Zane. But as someone who's walked beside your father and preserved this name, I must ask, do you really think this woman fits our legacy?" Zane chuckled coldly. "Our legacy? Or yours?" Ngozi stiffened. "You know what I mean. These things matter. The world is watching. Investors, partners, our political connections. Do you want to risk all of that over a woman who might not last the pressure of your world?" Zane leaned back, expression unreadable. "The only thing I'm risking," he said calmly, "is repeating the mistake of letting people dictate who I'm allowed to love." Ngozi's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "Love," she said quietly. "Such a fragile word for such a heavy price. I only hope she's worth what you lose." Zane stood, brushing imaginary dust from his shirt. "She's not worth what I'll lose. She's worth what I've already found." He walked away without another word. But as the gate shut behind him, Ngozi made a call. "Follow her," she said to the private investigator on the line. "I want to know everything, who she's connected to, where she's been, and what she's hiding. Everyone has something, and I'll find hers." In that moment, the war Mabel never asked for began quietly, not with bullets or knives, but with whispers and shadows. And while Zane fought for her love in the light, Ngozi was preparing to destroy it from the dark. The air was unusually dry that afternoon, and Mabel had just laid the twins down for their nap when she heard frantic knocks at her door. It was her landlord, shirt unbuttoned, sweat streaking down his forehead. "Madam, I no when happen he cried. "I no give anybody key, but dem don scatter lock and say dem be from court." Behind him stood two rough-looking men claiming to be acting on an eviction notice. But Mabel knew better. There had been no court papers served. No warning. Just chaos. She argued with them, begged for time, even called Zane, who didn't pick up because he was in a board meeting. As the confrontation escalated, one of the men shoved her aside. "You day form big, madam, because you day follow rich man ABI? Now you go no say Lagos, no get feelings." They forced the door open. Mabel screamed. One of the twins woke up wailing. Ibube coughed violently as dust filled the room. The second twin stirred. And that's when she smelled it. Something off. Burning. Within minutes, smoke filled the air. One of the men had lit a match while kicking boxes in frustration, not realizing there was a leaking kerosene stove behind the curtain. Flames erupted with terrifying speed, licking the wooden ceiling panels. "Fire!" Mabel screamed, grabbing both boys and sprinting down the hallway as neighbors began shouting and throwing buckets of water. Her skirt caught the edge of a charred table as she tripped near the stairwell, nearly dropping one child. "Help!" she screamed, coughing violently, her arms wrapped around the twins. The smoke blinded her. The heat wrapped around her like death itself. Then, suddenly, strong arms. Zane appeared from the haze like an angel forged from ash. He had rushed from the office the moment he saw her missed calls and the emergency ping from her shared phone location. Without speaking, he lifted both children and guided Mabel down the steps, shielding her with his jacket as the building raged behind them. By the time the fire was extinguished, half of the compound had been destroyed. No casualties, but what little Mabel owned was gone. She stood in the street, barefoot, eyes hollow, holding her babies while neighbors whispered and pointed. Zane wrapped his arm around her, shielding her from the murmurs. "You're coming with me," he said firmly. No more arguments. Mabel couldn't speak. The adrenaline had faded, and now all she felt was numbness. At the hospital later that night, a nurse confirmed that the twins had mild smoke inhalation but would be fine. Mabel sat beside their hospital bed, holding their tiny hands. Her voice was hoarse when she finally said to Zane, "They tried to erase me through lies. Now they've come for my children." Zane nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then it's war." And in that moment, a line was drawn. What began with a message had now become a mission, not just of love, but of protection, justice, and fury. Because now it was personal. The hospital corridor echoed with soft footsteps and quiet prayers. Mabel sat in the dim pediatric ward beside the twins' bed, their chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm as monitors blinked with gentle consistency. She hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. Her palms still smelled faintly of soot. Her knees were bruised from where she had fallen while trying to escape the fire. But none of it mattered. Her babies were alive. And Zane, the man who had once been a cold, untouchable figure behind a corporate wall, had carried them out with his bare hands. He hadn't called a driver. He hadn't sent a guard. He had come, himself. It wasn't the heroics that undid her. It was the look in his eyes when he saw the twins gasping for air. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something sacred, the kind of love that no longer questioned obligation or appearances, the kind of love that could not be faked. By the next morning, Zane had made his move. His legal team served a cease and desist to the so-called eviction agents. His security chief began a quiet but relentless investigation into who bribed them. All fingers pointed toward Cassandra, her fingerprints traced through a transfer from a dummy account to the landlord's cousin. Within hours, the story changed. The media, once obsessed with Mabel's past, now rallied behind her with renewed awe. Headlines shifted. Woman saved from fire by billionaire who defended her name. Zane Okonkwo publicly denounces socialite over endangerment of twins. Cassandra tried to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. Meanwhile, Zane stepped down from a high-profile investment board and publicly stated in an interview, "For years, I built things to feel alive. Now, I build nothing without soul. Family first. Everything else can wait." When asked about Mabel and the children, he didn't flinch. "They're not my responsibility. They're my answer." The world didn't just listen, it followed. Mabel watched the broadcast from the hospital television, holding her sons tightly as tears slid down her cheeks. The boy who once cried for milk was now a symbol of survival. The woman who once begged a stranger for food now had a man standing before the world saying, "She's enough." And Zane, the billionaire who once buried his emotions in glass towers, had opened his heart to something far more precious, redemption. That night, when he came to visit her again, she stood before him in the hospital hallway and said the words she'd been too afraid to believe. "You were the miracle I didn't know I had sent that message to. You didn't just feed my children. You gave me back my name, my future, my fire." Zane smiled softly, pulling her into an embrace that wasn't just romantic. It was home. "And you," he whispered, "gave me back my soul." Months later, the Okonkwo Foundation opened a brand new wing, the Uduak Center for Mothers and Children. Designed to serve single mothers, displaced families, and underprivileged youth, the center was Mabel's brainchild. She now stood proudly as the director of outreach programs, with her head held high and her sons, healthy, growing, and joyful, clapping beside her in the front row. The crowd applauded as she gave a short speech, humble but powerful. "There was a time I couldn't afford pap," she began. "A time when my children cried, and I cried silently with them. I sent a message to a number I thought belonged to a food bank. I didn't know it belonged to a man whose soul was starving too. That message changed both our lives. So today, I honor every woman who ever whispered into the dark hoping someone, anyone, would hear her. The crowd stood. Some wept. And in the background, Zane watched with a hand over his heart. Back in his office later that evening, Zane sat at his desk, now stripped of glass awards and excessive decor. Instead, the only thing that sat at the center of his desk, framed in gold, was the message. The original one, still preserved from his old phone, printed in its raw form. Please, if you have any leftover food, I have 2 babies. We haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm sorry to beg. He stared at it in silence for a while. Not because it brought pain, but because it reminded him of the exact moment his life turned, not by a business merger, not by a Forbes feature, but by the courage of a hungry woman who chose her babies over her pride. That message was no longer a plea. It was now a monument, a reminder that miracles don't always come wrapped in light. Sometimes they crawl out of shadows with shaking hands and swollen eyes and ask only for a little bread. Later that night, as the twins slept peacefully in their new room and Mabel sat beside him on the porch of their quiet countryside home, Zane looked at her and whispered, "That message changed everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Because you answered it," she replied. He kissed her forehead and smiled. "No, Mabel, because you sent it." And in that silence, wrapped in love, lit by stars, the woman who once begged for food and the man who once buried his heart beneath a fortune found everything they never knew they were searching for. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.